Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. Can President Trump's latest push on Ukraine punctuate the end of that war? Let's get to the bottom line. After almost 4 years of fighting, the United States is pushing both the Russians and the Ukrainians to end their war. Militarily, Russia has been making advances, and the U.S. proposal calls for designating Ukraine's eastern border areas to become a Russian-controlled, demilitarized zone. Washington was looking for creative ways to reassure Moscow that Ukraine won't join NATO. So what are the chances now of getting past the red lines of both sides and winding down Europe's latest war? Today we're talking with Kurt Volker, former U.S. ambassador to NATO and the former U.S. special envoy for Ukraine during President Trump's first term, and retired Colonel Heino Klinck, former director of U.S. Army International Affairs and the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, also in the first Trump administration. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Look, I need to tell our audience that this is a changing chessboard day by day. But Kurt, Ambassador Volker, why don't you handicap where we are right now from your perspective in terms of the possibility of achieving a real punctuation point, ending this conflict between Russia and Ukraine as a result of American negotiations?
Okay, well, I'd say, let's put it this way. The chances of getting a ceasefire or a peace deal this week, next week, or this month are probably zero. The chances of getting a real peace deal with Vladimir Putin ever, probably also zero. The chances of getting a ceasefire where the fighting stops and we can help Ukraine start to rebuild, Ukraine survives, there's a dispute over disputed territory that is unresolved, I'd put that at 75% sometime next year.
Do you think that the price for the Ukrainians is going to be too high even for that last outcome you talked about?
Well, it's a very high price, but again, there's very little they can do. They can't take back the land militarily without a massive military capability, including more soldiers. They are not going to give up territory that they currently control and Russia's unable to take. Putin has maximalist demands that he has never changed and never will. So that's not something Ukraine can ever agree to. But in terms of a price to pay, Ukraine has lost a lot of people. They've lost a lot of territory, about 20% of the country. It is largely destroyed. So the territory that they would gain back would be largely destroyed and largely depopulated. It's a terrible price to pay. The bombing of Ukrainian cities and civilians and infrastructure, that's also a terrible price to pay. But if they were able to get a ceasefire in place, there would also be the opportunity to rebuild, and they will build back better, to coin a phrase. They will be replacing old Soviet-era structures that have been damaged with new modern infrastructure and equipment, and they'll be integrating into the European economy. So in the long run, for the Ukrainian people, a ceasefire and development is the best option.
There have been several previous attempts to try to achieve some form of peace deal or some form of ceasefire that have failed. But I'm just interested, as you sort of look at this episode of the negotiator Steve Witkoff trying to mimic to some degree the very interesting deal that they seem to have pulled off with Gaza, which was a multi sort of 20-point deal. This was 28 points. Maybe it's 19 now. I don't know how many points are there. But what are your take on the sausage-making process of getting to where we are right now?
Right. Well, Steve, I think your comparison to Gaza is an apt one. I think that the Trump administration, particularly Steve Witkoff, President Trump, Jared Kushner, were very encouraged by the success they had with Gaza. And this was hammering out a very tough proposal, forcing Hamas to really have to accept that, getting a few compromises out of Benjamin Netanyahu. But they were able to do that. In Russia-Ukraine, however, they did it completely backwards. It's as if they sat down with Hamas, drafted a plan, and then told Israel they have to accept it. Clearly, that would never have worked. And in the case of sitting down and drafting a plan with Russia and then telling Ukraine this is it, that's not going to work either. So what they have now done after that initial Dmitriev-Witkoff plan, they've revised that under the leadership of Marco Rubio to something that the Ukrainians say is passable. They are going to present this to the Russians. We can only assume that Putin and Lavrov will say this is completely unacceptable. And so where we will be is where we have been since day one in the Trump administration. Ukraine never wanting this war and wanting peace, but also needing to defend their country. Russia never wanting peace, but wanting capitulation of Ukraine and subjugation of Ukraine to Russia, which will not happen. And the Trump administration faced with a choice of either putting pressure on Putin to actually cause him to want to reach a ceasefire or letting this drag on. So far, it's been allowed to drag on. I think it will continue to drag on for several more months until Putin's economy gets to such a point and his finances get to such a point that he's going to have to actually seek a ceasefire.
Heino, I hear Kurt Volker's cynicism, but where are you in this?
So I think a comparison to the Gaza deal is appropriate in the sense that if we get to a deal, if the warring factions get to a deal, it's going to be an imperfect deal, just like the Gaza deal is imperfect. And I think we all have to come to grips with the fact that it's not like we're going to just flip a switch and we're going to have peace break out in Europe all of a sudden. I think both the Russians and the Ukrainians, despite what we certainly hear them say publicly, I think they both warring factions have come to this conclusion that there's not a military solution. Neither side, and again, I would emphasize, the Russians are not on the cusp of a military victory. It's been almost 4 years of war, and they have made little progress. And what progress they have made on the battlefield has been at extraordinary cost. Now, Russia's strategic advantage is that they are able to absorb those costs more readily than the Ukrainians are in terms of manpower, because obviously the Russian population is more than 3 times the size of Ukraine. But I think the Russians too realize that they are not going to be able to defeat Ukraine militarily as they had planned to do in February of 2022. So I think we're now at a point whereas I am also cynical, I think that we are closer to some sort of imperfect deal than we have been previously, both from Ukraine's perspective and the Russian perspective. Now, I do have serious concerns and doubts that the Russians can be trusted to adhere to any kind of long-term deal. But I'm heartened by Secretary Rubio's comments over the weekend that underscored the fact that any kind of deal has to ensure that Ukraine's sovereignty is protected in the future, meaning that Russia, after it rearms, and it will rearm, I'm very confident that that will happen, doesn't launch the next phase of the invasion. Because whereas we in the United States and most of the West think this war started in 2022, the Ukrainians certainly think this war started during the Obama administration when the Russians took Crimea. So again, I'm cynical, I'm cautious, but I think we are closer to some sort of imperfect deal than we have been previously.
Heino, do you think that this deal is going to give Russia ultimately, whether overtly or covertly, a veto over NATO's further expansion, over Ukrainian membership in NATO?
I do not see any way that Ukraine is going to join NATO in the foreseeable future. Certainly not during the Trump administration. And I would also underscore that many of NATO's member states, including Germany, have been very, very cautious for advocating NATO membership. So I don't think it's going to happen, frankly. I could foresee a road to EU membership, and I would remind everyone that even the EU has a mutual defense clause in it. I could foresee EU membership coming before NATO, but I do not see NATO membership as being in the cards for Ukraine, at least not in the short or even intermediate term.
So, Kurt, I hear what Heino is saying, but to me, it sounds like Ukraine's sovereignty has been clipped in that formulation. It also, to many people, I can tell you how a lot of journalists are going to write, this is another form of 21st century Munich, that you end up capitulating on very key issues that ultimately become a green light to further misbehavior by Russia in that sphere. What is your take?
Well, Steve, if the agreement were to say that Ukraine cannot become a member of NATO, and even, for example, requires a change of their constitution, which requires them to seek NATO membership now, that would be limiting Ukraine's sovereignty for the future. I don't think that is going to be in a final agreement. I think it's not going to say anything. I think there will be assurances from the Trump administration that they're not going to support Ukrainian NATO membership, which is not that difficult for them to say because they don't support it anyway. Neither does Germany, as Colonel Klinck just said. But to put in something in an agreement that says it's going to be restricted, that would be problematic. And in fact, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte came out against that when the original 28-point plan was released. So look, NATO makes decisions by consensus of its members. There's nothing that's going to be in a bilateral agreement with one member and Ukraine or one member and Russia that's going to limit NATO's decision-making. NATO will make decisions by the consensus of its members. Now, of course, the United States is a member. So the United States could say, we're not going to support you. And that's as good as the word of the United States under President Trump. We'll have a new election. We'll have a new president. We'll see where that goes. So my best guess is on this point, it's going to be silent in any agreement if there is an agreement. And it'll be the Trump administration saying they're not going to support it. And then in the long run, my view is that Ukraine will be a member of NATO, because what is required for an end to the fighting is a security assurance for Ukraine, that there will be assistance to Ukraine on security so that they do not face the threat of Russian invasion again. Well, if we get into the habit of having security assurances for Ukraine, possibly from the US, certainly from European NATO allies, at a certain point, everyone's going to say, why do we have two systems in Europe, one for everybody except Ukraine and one for Ukraine? Why don't we just bring Ukraine into NATO? And at a point when there is no active fighting going on, I think that might seem possible. But in the short term, I think it's just going to be de facto no membership, nothing written in an agreement, but enough that we actually get a ceasefire.
But it raises the question as well of Joe Biden's comments that we would be with the Ukrainians as long as it took. Is this war a defining conflict for the United States in the sense it's representing the withdrawal of American concern, the withdrawal of American commitment, the shrinking back, and the ceding of this space for others that I'm just sort of interested is this a defining moment because it's really defining a very different American engagement in the future? Heino?
Well, the idealist in me would say, I wish the United States would have done more, candidly, during the Biden administration. I wish NATO would have done more. I wish the EU would have done more. But the reality now, as we find ourselves at the close of 2025, is we didn't do more. Every major weapon system that Ukraine requested during the Biden years, the answer was first no, then it was maybe, then it was yes, but you can only use it in such and such a way. But besides the rhetoric, the support from NATO and the EU in the early years was lackluster. We find ourselves now in a world, and this is where the realist in me comes to the fore, where the United States has challenges globally. Some perhaps self-inflicted, some self-imagined. But again, we have to remember that the rise of China in all facets of national security is in fact stretching our limits. So I do not think, when we look at this 50 years from now, we're going to see this as a defining moment. No, but I think part of it is the realization that the United States cannot do everything, everywhere, and all at once, and we do have to prioritize. What I'm hoping for is that with the hindsight of history, we'll be at a point where Europe finds this as a defining moment. Again, if we see the transition of European defense spending, the evolution of the political discussions, the political discourse, particularly in places like Germany, where they're looking at and taking the first steps in rebuilding a Bundeswehr that had been completely hobbled by by funding and other things. I'm hopeful that this will be a defining moment for Europe for again an entity that has a population greater than the United States, that has a GDP equivalent to that of the United States, to be able to do more in its own backyard. That being said, I do believe fundamentally that the United States has to be a backstop for NATO, well, particularly for NATO. But I think that the only way to deter Russia is for the United States to be involved in Europe, including from a defense, from a defense perspective.
Well, Steve, I agree with the words that Heino just said, except I come to the opposite conclusion, which is that I think this is a defining moment for the United States. If the United States allows Ukraine to be subjugated by a hostile foreign power, Russia, and does nothing meaningful about it, I think it's the end of U.S. leadership of a free world. I think that Europe will look now with great concern and caution about U.S. commitments generally, especially as it relates to Article 5 in NATO, especially as it relates to any countries that border Russia. I think countries in other parts of the world where we don't have alliance relationships are going to be much more skeptical about engagement with the United States on a position based on values and freedom and democracy. They'll look at it very transactionally, and then they'll evaluate the transactions. Who's offering a better deal, China or the United States? So when we hear somebody like Xi Jinping say that he doesn't want to see Russia defeated, I think that's what Xi Jinping has in mind. He doesn't care about how much of Ukraine Russia ends up with. He just doesn't want to see Moscow fall. So I think everybody has their different assessments of victory and defeat. We need to be careful what we think about what these things mean and try to define outcomes that are going to be lasting and beneficial for the free world.
Well, I really appreciate that, Kurt, but I'm also interested from both of you on, basically the resilience or the wobbliness of American support and commitment in the region. If you look at Eastern Europe, Ambassador Volker and I both spent a lot of time there. I'd say the picture is mixed there, in terms of attitudes, public attitudes, leadership attitudes about Russia, Ukraine. It's become complex. I mean, I used to go to Eastern Europe and you felt intense concern about what was happening in Russia, Ukraine. Now you're seeing political establishment shift into at least an ambivalent posture or even a pro-Russia posture. And I'm interested, Kurt, in what you think that's doing to the to the strength of the American resolve on this.
Yeah, well, I think the cause and effect is the other way around. The lack of American resolve has, I think, created a sense of uncertainty and vulnerability in Central and Eastern Europe. So publics are more cautious now about full-throated support for a country like Ukraine, whether it's being invaded by Russia, because if they feel that if they go out on a limb, we may not be there to help them. And this goes back to the Obama administration, right, where Russia invaded Ukraine. We did nothing. We did not uphold the Budapest Memorandum that said we would guarantee Ukraine's territory at the time. And we maintained an arms embargo on Ukraine. We refused to allow them to have lethal weapons. And that was back in 2014. That situation persisted throughout the Obama administration. Trump allowed them to get weapons, but that was at a time when he was not really focused on Ukraine. There was not an active war to the degree there is now. Under Biden, when Russia launched a full-scale invasion, we offered Zelensky to leave the country rather than to immediately step in with arms. So I think that this has really jolted societies in Central and Eastern Europe. They're not so sure that we are going to win this in the sense that they meaning Russia doesn't defeat Ukraine, doesn't take over Ukraine. And if we don't help get the right outcome here, right, they don't want to be exposed.
Right. Heino, I'd love to get your take on Eastern Europe and the differences of perspective inside Europe and even inside NATO on this challenge.
Well, let's remember that there has never been unanimity within Europe as a whole. If you travel to places like Madrid and Rome, throughout the conflict, you would get different opinions than you would get, for instance, in Vilnius and Warsaw. That's just, Southern Europe in particular has viewed this as a more distant threat than Eastern Europe. Those countries that have a more recent memory of living under the Soviet and Russian yoke have responded differently. Then, of course, you have the rise of populism in a number of countries, both in Eastern Europe as well as in Central Europe, including in Germany. Let's remember the AfD is the second largest party, a party that associates itself with the Russian Federation in many respects, has been at times overtly supportive of Putin's foreign policy agenda. So again, Europe is not a monolith. It never has been. We have seen that the opinions have differed throughout and
Right.
for a variety of opinions. And I think that it is irrespective of what the United States has or has not said and done.
Right.
So I think you're going to see this continue. And again, if you also, think about some of the domestic political issues within Ukraine itself, it has fed some of the discord in Europe about support for Zelensky in particular. So again, Europe has a variety of opinions that have evolved. And I think you're going to continue to see that.
Kurt, let me get a question to both of you real quick here. Andrei Yermak, very powerful figure in Ukrainian political sphere, one of the top aides, if not the top aide to President Zelensky, has resigned, corruption allegations. Does this change the game at all? Does this seriously weaken Zelensky, or is it a non-event?
I don't think it changes much, to be honest, Steve. The fundamentals are about Russia trying to take over Ukraine, Ukraine defending itself. Yermak was a very trusted, close aide to President Zelensky. He centralized a lot of power in Ukraine into the presidential office and then exercised power from there. In many ways, it was a natural response to war and a natural response to trying to make sure that he was protecting his friend, President Zelensky. But it ended up being over-centralization and making Ukraine, in fact, less effective in terms of governance and running the country, reform, economy, fighting corruption, etc. There's nothing to say that he was involved in this corruption scandal yet. We'll find out if there is, but frankly, I don't think we'll find that. However, I think that this will now give an opportunity for President Zelensky to empower the Prime Minister, Yulia Sviridenko, who will run a government that is a little bit more empowered and functioning a little bit more like a normal government. This may actually be a positive step for Ukraine in the end.
Well, fascinating and sobering discussion. I want to thank you both very much. Former U.S. diplomat Kurt Volker and former Pentagon official Heino Klinck, thank you so much for joining us today.
Been a pleasure, Steve. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
So what's the bottom line? Starting wars is easy, but ending them is very, very difficult. Just ask the United States about that. What Washington is trying to do is deliver to each side something they can accept and sell to their own people. Ukraine is so complicated because it used to be part of the Soviet Union, which dissolved into Russia. So the historical memory of being close and now deeply, deeply divided makes this conflict even sadder and even uglier. It's hard to predict how the unorthodox approach of the Trump administration and its chief negotiator, Steve Witkoff, will work out between the two warring parties precisely because it's so unorthodox. What is clear is that whatever end to this war comes is not likely to be a permanent and stable resolution. And that's the bottom line.